America became at its imperial zenith, at its peak of whatever we want to believe it once was, its constitutional foundation has always, arguably, been the most egalitarian on earth. Really, just best for the average people. Right? And I don't even think that encapsulates the word. Let's look at what the relating to or believing in the principle that all people are equal and deserve equal rights. That's the exact definition for egalitarian. But that generally translates to the average person having much more control and influence over what happens in their life. And the problem is that it's, and always has been, slowly been chipped away by people one step at a time. They're simply saying, arguably, the most egalitarian on earth. Not to say that's perfect, but it says, could it be that those ideas enshrined in the Bill of Rights are considered an impediment to the progressive New World Order? It's a very good question to ask. The U.S. falling into failed statehood could even act as a moral lesson to the rest of the world and be held up as a warning about what can happen when, quote, liberty's taken too far, when you give them too much freedom, right? Or when people are allowed to, quote, selfishly put their own rights ahead of the public good. Yeah, that one really registers, doesn't it? But right? We'll take the injection for the benefit of everybody else. Yeah, that's not really jiving with most people. Right? Let your gas prices skyrocket to defend freedom. Yeah, no thank you. Because it's not really defending freedom is the point. Perhaps the U.S. is being torn apart, or encouraged to tear itself apart, is the key to bringing about the next stage of the Great Reset. One thing is for sure, no matter the end game, U.S. politics are dry tinder piled high, just waiting for a spark. And the point here is not to say that liberty can be taken too far. That's not possible. The point here is what we're talking about is them pointing
gonna have to check the backside of the hill here.
Engineered collapse as a reason to say, see, that's why nationalism doesn't work. That's why liberty and giving too much freedom is not acceptable, because it leads to this problem, reaction, solution. That's the problem. Waiting for you to react and then go, well, guess what though? We've got the solution. A Great Reset. You just need to see how obvious this is, in my opinion. Oh, and then Derek adds, if you still want an abortion, try the Pfizer vaccine. Too soon? Okay, I'm sorry. Let's continue. Monkeypox. Monkeypox outbreaks. Monkeypox outbreak, according to Tedros from the WHO, is not yet a global public health emergency. Now, of course, I put the inflection there, but interesting choice of words, right? Not yet.
No.
Interesting choice, especially timing. But the point is, they've come out now and said it's, as of right now, not a global public health emergency.
All the way to the beginning.
The important point made by Stat here is that it only took a week after the first time said they were on COVID for it to become one, in their eyes, or their narrative. But it says the WHO on Saturday, today, declined to declare, which I love the way they frame that, declined to declare, which was like, so basically they're being pushed to do it. They just decline to do what everybody wants, instead of just not calling it what it is, or whatever. But it says declined to declare the unprecedented monkeypox outbreak that has spread around the world a public health emergency as of now. And that's the linking to the article. A public health emergency of international concern, or PHEIC, grants the WHO Director General certain powers, as we know, such as the ability to recommend how countries should respond. Right now, it's only recommended. We've already seen that translate into action by the governments that allow it, but that's where the whole treaty with teeth is building, and I'll show you that part next. While it's a legal lever the agency can use, it's also a tool that can grab public attention and steer it to try to address the burgeoning health threats. Such a declaration could further rally donors and member countries to increase funding, of course. The WHO can revisit its decision, as always. In January 2020, for example, the WHO didn't declare the emerging coronavirus crisis, as they frame it, as a public health concern, only to do so a week later. So just hear that in regard to them saying, nope, not a problem. Doesn't mean that they're just going to decide to push it in later. But here is the most alarming part. Well, first of all, ask yourself why the not declaring it a public health emergency wasn't worthy enough for them to post. Oh, well, maybe they just did. Okay, so that's funny. Right before I went live, it hadn't updated, but now it looks like it just dumped a whole bunch of stuff. So that's where it was. And then, so 3 hours ago, I guess, that's pretty easy. I feel like I refreshed it right before I started. In any case, I take it back. Looks like they did post that they made comments about this. But here's the most alarming point. This is posted on Tedros' own Twitter feed. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated, according to them, in their perception that global health security, which again, this is the frustrating part about how they're framing this. It's not about your choices individually, about a county or a state or even a country. No, it's global health security, which, by the way, again, is not global health. Now it's global health security. You know, like Public Health of England became the UK Health Security Agency. Like it's a CIA version of health. It's alarming where this is going, the biosecurity state. But he says this pandemic has demonstrated that the global health security cannot be left to voluntary mechanisms or goodwill. So it can't be left to your choice or your belief that you're doing the right thing. We have to decide what those mean. How alarming is that? What gives you the right to make that statement? It's right here, by the way, just to make clear, this is what he says. These are his remarks from the Commonwealth Foreign Ministers meeting of June 23rd. Reported cases of COVID-19 here in Rwanda are now at their lowest levels since the pandemic began. We'll go back to that. That's not true, by the way. Transmission is increasing in many countries, including some of yours. This is just about COVID-19, right? Not even monkeypox. It says this is despite the fact that testing and sequencing have dropped markedly around the world, which is blinding us to the evolution of the virus. So they want people to just forever, non-stop forever, continue to test and sequence, and that's alarming. That's never used to be the way that this was. We're at a point where even Fauci, and I'll make this point next, is saying that we're past the stage of, well, so why are we still continuing to, this is under the assumption, the fear-mongering, hypothetical, guessing assumption that there's just one next right around the corner. That never ends. There will always be the next one in their minds. That's what they keep saying. So this never goes away. Now, you may think that's the right choice, but all it does is create a governance of your, it controls your life around the threat of an unknown, it's the war on terrorism at the next level. And all that did was increase your threat. Now it says, and 40% of the world's population remains unvaccinated. Still, remember, still, by the way. Now what does that mean? 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shot, 4 shot, 5 shot? Who knows? But almost half the world. Now, continuing, it says, so although we have made great progress and have many reasons for optimism, the perception that the pandemic is over is understandable but misguided. Ending the acute phase of the pandemic must remain our collective priority. Well, that's confusing, seeing as how Fauci already declared that we are out of the acute phase. Oops. Right, so inconsistent anyway at the very least. So this is just about shifting narratives and agendas. We've never been in a pandemic, based on their earliest assessments of what pandemics meant, that they just changed once COVID started. We proved that right in the beginning. Barely at a level 2, according to their every document pre-COVID-19. But they just say, well, because we're to change it because we want this to be serious. Or how the UK put this back in 2020 at no longer a serious health concern, way back in 2020, and it's still there right now. But apparently that doesn't matter because it's the biggest pandemic of the century. Okay, so he says we're still there. Fauci says we're not. But we're not allowed to challenge WHO, right? Keep saying that. The lessons of the pandemic has taught us the most important of those lessons is the centrality of health. Right. So the fact that we need to centralize control over your health from our standpoint. Right? We need to centralize the control of your health from a WHO worldwide standpoint. As foreign ministers, you have seen that the pandemic is so much more than a health crisis. Oh, is it now? It is a global crisis that touches every area of life. Business, economic, education, employment, families, technology, tourism, trade, travel, politics, security. Okay, explain for me how a alleged virus can affect education or employment or families or technology or any of those things. No, your actions around it. Even if you want to blame that or say that that's the absolute and it has to happen, let's stop being dumb about this and say that your actions because of this, that you can say were justified, are what affected this, not the pandemic you say happened. The economy collapsed because of your lockdowns. Education collapsed because of your lockdowns and the masks you force them to wear and injections that are doing everything else. The employment, same reason. Families, same reason. None of that's because of a virus that's circulating they say has happened. None of that. Sure, you could argue that not doing anything could have taken people's lives. Could have. I guess we'll never know. I guess the data shows plenty. But the point being that they continue to act like what they did to you is because of the thing that they pointed at. One of the key recommendations of the reviews was for a new legally binding international instrument. That's what we're talking about. To support closer cooperation and coordination between countries in the face of global threats. Very, very soft way to say that. Legally binding means you can tell people what they can do and what they can't do. Countries to now agree on a common approach with common rules for a common response to threats arising from our relationship with nature. Threats that we cannot entirely control. So they get to dictate what gets to happen. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated, here it is, that global health security, from their perspective, their opinion, cannot be left to voluntary mechanisms or goodwill. We need to be able to tell people what they have to do and make sure that they do it. So voting doesn't matter anymore at that point, right? That will supersede everything. That's the EU over individual nations. Sure, you are the pretend leader, but the EU is the real leader. In our view, the new instrument can only be truly effective in keeping future generations. Future generations safer from pandemics if it is a binding accord that safeguards individual freedoms and national sovereignty. An instrument can only be truly effective in keeping future generations safe from pandemics if it is a binding accord that safeguards individual freedoms. I mean, come on. Every time you see them end the sentence with, we make sure we consider your national sovereignty and your freedoms, that means the opposite. A binding accord that by its definition undermines your freedoms and sovereignty, that safeguards those things. I mean, it's just inherently stupid. What are we driving towards? The proposal? I'll cut to the chase without the extra stuff at the end. Stronger governance, stronger systems and tools, detecting and responding, stronger financing, and stronger WHO at the center of all of it. That's what it all means. And of course, in a coherent, inclusive, and accountable way. Right? Nonsense. All those extra words are meaningless. Stronger governance is what it means. Underpinning all of this must be the conviction that health is not a luxury for the rich, but a human right for all. An end in itself. Now again, the same kind of point here. Health is not something given to you. It's your responsibility. Now yes, money can make that quite easier, yes. Now there's plenty of other ways to go than creating a situation where you dictate for everybody equally what they're supposed to be doing. Like, that's just tyrannically crazy. How about instead, you make sure everybody can, I mean, look, I don't even want to get into that. Like, you get into different things that I would probably take issue with in different ways. Funding, universal basic income. The bottom line is people can make their own choices, and being healthy in most every way is not about buying vitamins or injections. It's about healthy living. Choosing to not eat certain things and eating whole foods, which in most cases are, yes, cheaper than the garbage they pump at you and pretend is cheaper. It's an illusion. Buying fast food every day is way more expensive than buying whole foods in a bulk and eating meals you cook every day. But how do I have time for that, right? Stop. Just stop. We all do. The point here, guys, is that at the end of the day, it's about creating the illusion that it's only the rich that are healthy. That's just simply not true. But this is where it leaves us. Is Fauci lying about or rather, both of them lying about where we are, but contradicting each other to achieve a different end. And I want to include one thing before we go to the next point my brother shared with me today. Just to show you this isn't going away, this is today, it's published. Detection of a SARS-CoV-2 intra-host recombination during superinfection with Alpha and Epsilon variants in New York City. Now, I can promise you this is going to go through all the corporate outlets, and they're going to point to this and go, new variants converging, and it could be more dangerous, and hype, and fear, because new variants are coming together, and it's superinfection, and all the big flashy terms. Except when you cut to the chase. Well, first it says we identify an instance of kind of what they're calling superinfection, which is a term they use, whereby an individual is infected with, they claim, 2 different variants.
Okay,
same kind of thing with
that's the sweet
Deltacron, or whatever they tried to already do, which fell on its face. First of all, how do they find this? PCR test. So how do we not know that they're just simply testing a PCR test and finding what they want to see? That's always the point. PCR test is not definitive in testing for these things, as any expert will tell you. But it says these findings support the potential for these things recombining. Now, even right there, you can argue that they're going to hype it as the potential for extra dangerous things. PCR screening. Well, here's the point at the bottom that I guarantee will be left out. Yes, because we read these things, right? Our search for alpha epsilon variant recombinants in New York City did not identify genomes that would suggest onward transmission of either of the major or minor strains derived here or a recombinant offspring. So what is this even talking about? So by all points of science here, there's no indication that it will continue to transmit individually or if they recombine. Now, mark my words, if this gets hyped, that point will be left out. But my point is, guys, this is going to continue. They're using this, the argument, if it wants it to, it'll continue. Now, to the point about Rwanda. Didn't he say that the cases are lowest right now since the beginning of the pandemic? Well, here's the last 3 months. Pretty obviously, since April, it's been on an increase. Pretty sharp increase since June. Plenty of correlations we could point out, but I'm not going to go there. Simply increasing. Now, yes, it's lower than it's been before. Let's go back to the full picture. So, since the beginning would be right over here, right? But here we could point out, there's points, well, let's just point out right here. It's at 26 new cases is the peak right there. So, his argument would be that there's been no other point except before this all started where 26 cases was the low. Except that's not true. Right there. Plenty of time. This whole lull, there's like months right here, or a couple months, where it's well below 28. So that's a lot. Here's another point, where it's well below 28. So there's been at least 2 or 3 examples where that's already been the case. So why would he lie about it? Because it makes it sound good. That because we do the right thing there, it's lower than it's ever been. Not true. It's all about saying vaccines work. That was the point he was trying to make. Now, is it low because of what they're doing? Well, if that's the case, why would you see it starting to spike again? But it could be. I don't think that's the case based on all the science and data we have in front of us. It's probably just already declining, or whatever they were hyping that this jump is PCR testing or conflation, and then suddenly they go, well, stop looking because now we're back to it. Well, however it works. I'm just throwing out possibilities. The bottom line is what he said wasn't true. Simple as that. Now, on that same point, great example. Thank you, Snyder, for pointing this out. It's right on the mass vaccine in Canada has taken the average deaths increased since then. This is the point he's making clear. Sheldon makes this clear. Thank you, Sheldon, for breaking this down. Excuse me.
Well, it's probably one person, not me.
2 years ago, on this day, this was posted on June 23rd, there were an average of 13 COVID deaths per day, averaged out over 7 days. No vaccines were available.
Yeah, I follow you, but
Then it goes on to say by 1 year ago today, as of the 23rd, so that was 2 years, this is 1 year. As of that, 22% of the population of Canada had gotten, quote, fully vaccinated, which was, at that point, 2, unless it was the single dose. The COVID deaths on the same day showed no improvement from the previous year, and we're still at 13 deaths per day over a 7-day average. So you have at this point, 22%, so a huge influx of injections with no discernible difference. Then you see, jumping, it says at that point, 82.7% of Canada is now fully injected, as of the date we're discussing here. And it goes to say 55.5% of those 12 years and older at that time are boosted. Same time, 2.6 million people are boosted, as he says, to the tits. And now there is an average, during that period, an average of 22 deaths per day over 7 days. He's talking about today, obviously. For a more transmissible but less lethal variant of COVID. An increase in 9 deaths per day of people that are injected. So if it's a less dangerous variant, you're seeing an increase in deaths. Now, of course, you could add in the argument that more people are injected, but that doesn't hold water with what you're seeing here at the end of the day. Because it continues in that direction. It's the opposite correlation they continue to argue. But then it says, and the majority of deaths are in people who have been jabbed. The super majority in those jabbed to the tits. And people who got the jabs believe the people who didn't get the jabs are responsible for this. Just thought I'd lay it all out for you. Now, this stuff is easy to prove. All based on the Canadian data, directly, in most cases, from this exact place, from these breakdown of the Worldometer or wherever that directly comes from. It's amazing this stuff is there, and people just don't care. This, just to add to that, this is the report we just went over a couple days ago. Same thing. The majority of this stuff is happening with people with 3 doses in their body. Barely any, according to even the New South Wales government, all 77 were people that had at least a couple doses in their body, which seemed to contradict what they posted right there. But regardless, it's unbelievably centered around people with injections. Now, here's Dr. Birx admitting that the government lied to you. And yes, I'll have some points to make after that, but let's take a listen right here, actually.
You're an expert. You were on the task force. You were part of this effort when you were in the previous administration. You're saying in this administration that you can't rule out the fact that our government was lying to us when they told us the vaccinated could not get the virus.
I don't know about the discussions that they had in the task force, so I can't tell you that. I can tell you as a family member who had individuals that were susceptible. Of course, we got everybody vaccinated, but we still use layered protection during surges because I knew potentially the vaccine immunity would wane like natural immunity waned, and there was evidence that every 4 months reinfection was occurring in South Africa.
Wow. When the government told us that the vaccinated couldn't transmit it, was that a lie or was that a guess? Or is it the same answer?
I think it was hope that the vaccine would work in that way. And that's why I think scientists and public health leaders
Oh, emotional little bitches. When she said emotional little, motion-driven little
This is important for the country to know.
bitches.
So when I asked the question, when the government told us
Hope
that the
never.
vaccinated couldn't get it,
You
and
know,
I asked
every
the
time they
question,
use it,
yes or a lie,
everybody
you said we
died.
don't know.
They hoped
So
it
we
would.
think it was
Yeah, right.
So what we do know is it wasn't true. So they were either guessing, lying, or hoping, and communicating that information to the citizens of this country.
I think they were hoping, but you should know in those original phase 3 trials that were done in this country that we only measured for symptomatic disease. So we weren't proactively testing everybody in those trials to see if they got infected with mild or asymptomatic disease. And so people had to present within the clinical trial.
Which in and of itself is a manipulation, but I'm going to make comments about a couple of things at the end.
So we never had the data that it was going to protect against asymptomatic infection.
I'm just struck with the irony. We got government agencies guessing, hoping, or lying with the information they're presenting to the American people. And this is the same administration that wants to set up the disinformation governance board and wants to talk about misinformation. And then the biggest permit of misinformation, false information, hopeful information, but not accurate and true information. Again, the frustration I think some of the folks I get to representing have shared with me.
Now, obviously, currently, yes, because they're currently in control of the agenda. I mean, this is what's so frustrating about the two-party
Oh, it's
paradigm.
terrifying.
Are we really going to pretend like there wasn't just as much misinformation during Trump's reign over the agenda?
Yeah.
I mean, for crying out loud, guys, Birx herself was making things up. Fauci was there making things up. Fauci was part of Trump's administration. Come on. They all were lying then, too. Now, you could pretend that Trump didn't know. I'll let you take that. I don't agree to some degree, to some point. But I think ultimately, guys, that this is about quietly admitting from a Republican in the minds of Democrats, she's a Trump person and blah blah blah, so they're going to ignore it. She's lying for the agenda. Whatever. That's how that goes. The point is, though, this is somebody involved with the original rollout of this that's admitting to us, because you can prove it with the studies, that they gamed what they found. They hoped instead of knew and censored us for pointing these things out. That's incredible. Right? Don't forget, Operation Warp Speed was started by Donald Trump, guys, and this is where this all continues. Just because it got worse, as it logically was going to during Biden's administration, doesn't mean that it wasn't started with Trump's administration. They simply just handed off the baton. I would argue that if it was in reverse, it'd be the same way. Biden was starting it, and Trump would have made it worse, whether he meant to or not. This is a agenda carried out by more than one person in a presidential position. But admitting the government lied to us about injections. Look at that. Now, my point here, just really quickly, is that the waning of natural immunity, guys, that I'm not saying it's not the case. But from what I can see, at least 4 different peer-reviewed studies that I continue to point out, the main one being the ultra-potent discussion, I can just grab it real quick, that I often point out, and this one still stands, because this one is in regard to Omicron as well, which is where they say we still are. And all it says is that people that got sick in the beginning. Now, understand, this is arguing from within their narrative. I understand the arguments of whether this is, completely an illusion and so on. But the point is, what they're claiming is that people that got sick in the beginning, with the original thing, have continued to this day to make antibodies to all variants. That's what it says in their conclusion. It says structural and functional analysis revealed that the antibody breadth is mediated by targeting. It says, I took this first part. Demonstrates that convalescent subjects previously infected with the ancestral strain produce antibodies that cross-neutralize emerging variants of concern with high potency. That was during Omicron. It's telling the same thing. The point is that there's a lot of those. So I just take issue with this argument that we already knew natural immunity was waning. They weren't even admitting it was real until very recently. So it seems like a very dishonest point. So maybe that's the entire point of why this is being admitted. Or the fact that asymptomatic spread. How many times do we have to go over this? Like, the argument that that's even possible was disputed at the very beginning by people in even Fauci. Asymptomatic, being with a respiratory virus, is just simply not a thing. Or the fact that we have examples of 10 million person studies that found only 300 people that they claim were asymptomatic. 0 of them were transmissible. Why? They didn't have symptoms. Simple as that. 10 million people, peer-reviewed. I don't know what else people ultimately want. Now, you can still, I'm not saying ignore everything else like they claim, like they currently do to you. But there's not a lot of reports that are as sound that you should challenge that with, or there's plenty of others that say the same kind of thing. And yet here we are. Waning in natural immunity, asymptomatic spread. Is that why that's here? I don't know. My point is simply to acknowledge that they're admitting they were lying now. We have to continue to hear them. Excuse the sirens in the background here. While we're waiting for that to change, actually, I believe, just so you can see me again, just what I was trying to do before, which I don't know why it was so difficult to make happen, was to have another camera view. I don't know why it didn't happen last time. Very frustrating in any case. But this is why I was doing this today, to sort of kind of test these different things with Scott and I having some shows coming up and having different angles. That was the real point, just to make sure people see it. Anyway, getting back to the point. This is important to understand that we were lied to, right? And speaking about the fake news discussion, I just want to include this again. This is Biden standing up, didn't say it, but in his post from his account, said that these were approved for the youngest kids. That's simply not true. Everybody knows that. They don't even have the courage to call that out. You can't pretend like, oh, he just got it wrong. That's a really important accident if you want to pretend it is. That's straight up medical misinformation. You are telling parents this has been approved by the FDA. It hasn't been. It's been emergency authorized. Very, very, very different. And I posted, here's the FDA page. Authorized for emergency use. So as I said, but it wasn't approved, as your team just told your millions of followers, Biden. It was emergency authorized, which is very different. Is that not medical misinformation? Oh, I see. As long as it misinforms in a pro-vaccine direction, well, it's allowed then. Got it. Sort of why I tweet out about how this thing will make you, fly or not die, and they're still there. Lots of engagement, all sorts of reports. It doesn't matter. By the way, a lot of people, by the way, have reported this tweet. It's still there. So Twitter doesn't care, even when it's obviously and provably fake or misinformation, whether accident or not, as long as it's the right people or the right conversation. That's called being a hypocrite. Then we have a tweet with a video with Dr. McCullough pointing out something very important. Why do the majority of people do, I don't know, fine, but okay with these injections while others have very deadly side effects? It's an important question to ask.
The COVID-19 vaccine take the cake for the risk of death. And Mark Giordano from Planet Scientist, in a lot of our working groups, has proposed a name for this. It's called the Russian roulette theory of COVID-19 vaccination. You know, when messenger RNA vaccines are made, the messenger RNA is pretty unstable. It has to be cooled, and probably each strand is a little bit different than the next one because of how the base pairs line up, and there has to be humanized code in it so the ribosomes are needed, and then there's these nucleoside analog caps. The belief is that each vial and each lot is different, okay? And on top of that, there are multi-use vials. So there's actually a lot of needles being stuck in each vial. So there's an opportunity for changing oxidation, sulfation, maybe changes in cooling. And so one theory here, Dave, is a lot of people actually probably get a dud. If they get a shot and not much happens, they don't get much in they don't really get much in the way of side effects. But if someone really gets a good install of messenger RNA coding for the lethal Wuhan spike protein, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It injures organs and in fact causes death. And when we apply the Bradford Hill criteria for death due to COVID-19 vaccines, we fulfill all the criteria. It's epidemiologically consistent that the vaccines are causing death in a large number.
And we've talked about his point on that before, right? These things are there for a reason. So they're meeting all the criteria, and yet it's all fake news because we don't want to acknowledge that. It's sort of like a Coach Postulate's argument, you know. It's like they're just jumping away from it because it doesn't apply because they don't want it to, right? They're there for a reason. If it's meeting all the criteria, then it's hurting people, or at the very least, it should be an honest conversation about how it can meet that criteria, and you can argue it's not hurting people, right? I mean, it's obvious. The point is that all of these things are being shown to be very clear, scientifically. That's the paradox of where we are. The trust the science crowd are now, I mean, in flagrant fashion, running from the science. I mean, it's embarrassing. But it's not just about the lots, by the way, in my opinion. I agree that seems to play a factor. Or the great point he made there, that the mRNA, like I'm actually going to bring this up in a future show. Somebody shared this with me today. But that they're coming out now arguing that the CRISPR-9 gene editing tool has been very important, but it has a very high error rate. Why? Because there's something new we're going to use now. I'm going to talk about that later. But what's interesting to me is that isn't that an important factor? Because that's sort of the technology being applied here. And so that's what he's saying is you're producing things that just don't ultimately work sometimes or unstable. And mRNA, nanoparticles alone, and spike protein by itself are all individually problematic. So I think it's also about just how healthy people are and what their body is dealing with. And, you know, like they said, these are time bombs. But nobody cares in the corporate media. Now I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly just to wrap this up under two, because that's what I was aiming for the most part. Is I want this is important, but it's ultimately a conversation that needs to be investigated more, and that was the whole point of showing it. Now, this is Dave Cohen pointing out yet again more of these horrific blood clots from arteries from bodies, people that are dying, that nobody wants to point out in the corporate media, because it just doesn't matter. Because it's obviously wildly obvious this is not okay and unprecedented. But it must be climate change or something else, right? But as Daniel Hayes points out again, amyloid fibrils caused from the spike protein. This person just asked, and he says, more of a hypothesis than proven for sure. Always good to question everything. So spike protein is behaving and is an amyloid, and it causes fibrils to assemble, according to Walter Chestnut. I post both these. Thank you for the links.